Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. We're going to talk about bass today. We talk about bass regularly because it's just so important to your mixes. If you do it wrong, your mix can sound muddy or boomy, or on the other side, it might sound thin and lifeless. The bass guitar is arguably the most important track in a typical rock pop mix. So today we're going to talk about specifically how to think and listen and adjust the bass to get the best results. So if you like mixing and you like my process to mixing, this mixing bass thing is one sliver of the whole pie. If you want to learn the whole pie, you can have that for free. It's called the 5-Step Mix Guide, and you can get it for free at 5stepmix.com. Okay, let's talk about bass. First of all, I'm not going to give you a bunch of EQ and compression presets to use. That's practically useless because I don't use the same settings ever. Because every bass player, every bass guitar, every bass amp, every song, every key, there's so many variables that the bass is going to change from one song to the next. So I don't have a formula for use this EQ every time. That wouldn't be helpful for you. How I can help you is talk a little bit about my thought process when I approach a bass track, what I listen for, how I listen to it, and then how I go in and fix those problems. That's what we're going to tackle today. So first thing we got to talk about is what is the bass and what role does it play in the mix? So I'm specifically talking about full production with drums and bass. That's what I'm mainly focusing on here. So to my ear, the bass guitar and the kick drum, let's flip those. The kick drum and the bass guitar are one and the same. I think of them as like teammates on a team accomplishing a goal together. I think of like the word boom, B-O-O-M. The kick drum is the B, the bass guitar is the and together they go boom, right? By the way, if you are not really a bass player, but you play the parts yourself or you play them in on a keyboard, I can typically tell if you're not a bass player because you pay no attention to what the kick drum pattern is doing. That's not to say kick and bass need to always play exactly the same thing, but if you play with like a good bass player and a good drummer, they're typically going to have a conversation about what the kick pattern is, and the bass player is more than likely going to try to hit the bass on those kick hits because they reinforce one another. The kick goes boom, but then the bass goes boom, and together they make this lovely boom sound that carries the entire low end of the mix. And remember, low frequencies carry a whole crap load of energy. So if you don't get the low frequencies right, your whole mix kind of falls apart. So this is very, very important, and that's what we're going to talk about today. To do that, we need to go over bass frequencies. I know, you think you know the bass frequencies, and maybe you do, but it's always worth checking yourself because a lot of times perception and reality can be different. So it's helpful to do an exercise like this pretty regularly. So here is a bass guitar. I'm going to let you just hear the raw bass first, and then we'll dive into this. Picked a very simple section of the song to help us with this. So that's your typical bass guitar. Now, in my mind, I divide bass up into about 4 groups of frequencies. I've got the lows, which is 0 to 100, the low mids, 100 to 300, the mids, 300 to 500, and then the high stuff, 500 and up, or 800 and up, sorry. And we're going to listen to each of these because you may think you know, but a lot of times you're a little off. And I don't mean that as an insult. I myself regularly do this just to remind myself. So first of all, let me hit play on this bass, the full bass. And after a few beats, I'm going to press the solo button on this low frequency range. And I want you, before I press it, to kind of guess in your mind, based on what you hear, what it's going to sound like when I press solo. This solo button, by the way, I'm not compressing anything. This just lets me isolate those sets of frequencies. It's going to just let us hear 0 to 100 hertz. So as it's playing, imagine in your head what that will sound like. And then when I click the button, let's see how close you were. Okay, here we go. Personally, let me go first. If you had asked me a couple decades ago, what do the lows sound like? I would have told you this. But the lows, everything below 100 hertz, is a full octave lower than that, maybe more. If you're listening on a phone, you probably can't hear that at all, but trust us, the rest of us on headphones or speakers, we can hear this big, deep, girthy low end. It's the part that moves the subwoofers, it's the part that we feel in our chest, and if we listen to the bass without it, it's certainly missing something. I mean, there's so much energy down there. We need it for the bass. It's really to my ears, this is my favorite section for a bass guitar. Now, let's listen to the mid-range, the low mid-range. I already talked about it, but here's what that sounds like. The low mids are always higher sounding than people tend to think. They tend to think of low mids as like way down there, but they're actually they're kind of right here in my vocal range, right? My voice is kind of hanging out in the low mids right now. The low mid frequencies for me, especially on bass, are what I call the headache frequencies. This sound gives me a headache. I literally am starting to get a headache right now from just listening to it for a couple of seconds. Listen to what happens if we remove this sound from the overall bass track. Right? It's not as big of a drop in volume, but there's so much warmth and character that happens in the low mids. Low mids aren't bad, they just can be selfish. And typically, I find the low mids are kind of peaked like this, and they're hiding or masking the deep low end. So by typically pulling down some low mids, I can hear that low end better, and I get a better feel on the bass, and it sits better in the mix. By the way, people say this all the time. How do you carve out space, whatever that means, in your kick drum and your bass guitar to make sure they don't like conflict with one another? I don't understand the question, because to me, bass and kick are kind of one and the same instrument almost. They're partners together. They both have low-end energy, and they're typically the only thing in the mix that is living down there below 100 hertz, right? That's where they reign. That's where they puff out their chest and say, this is my territory. So I don't really feel the need to like say, okay, the kick drum has a fundamental frequency at 80 hertz, so I'm going to cut that on the bass guitar and then boost at 60 hertz and then cut that on the kick drum so that they're complementary. They're complementary just by the way that they sound. Now, if the bass or kick needs an EQ for just balance reasons, sure, go for it. But I've never found myself doing that like back and forth compensating EQ thing. Just because it sounds good or makes sense on paper doesn't mean you actually need it in the mix. For me, getting the bass more balanced with itself, where the low mids aren't the primary culprit, and I'm hearing it more flatly, that typically just goes well with kick drum. I don't know what to tell you. It's just the truth. Now let's look at the mid-range. Mid-range is pretty uneventful. Right, I have to crank it just so you can hear it. That is, if you're playing like a Hofner style bass that doesn't have a lot of low end and is very mid-range heavy, you might get a little more information here, but typically I'm not paying too much attention here unless something's weird with like a pedal that's creating a lot of mid-range that's covering things up. I'll come into this mid-range, but typically I'm leaving this one alone. And then the high frequencies, same thing, not as much volume or energy, but there's a lot of good stuff happening up here. And that demonstrates something that I love about bass guitar, and kick drum for that matter. The lows and the highs on a bass guitar are almost completely separate. Meaning, if I have a bass guitar that has the low end feeling right, but I just can't hear that clarity, can't hear the fingers on the strings and the buzz and things like that I want to hear to make it stand out, I can go into the high frequencies and adjust accordingly. And messing with these typically does nothing down here to the low frequencies. They're very independent of one another. Same with the kick drum. A lot of other instruments, you can't do that as easily because there's not as a definitive distinction between here's the first chunk of frequencies and here's the other chunk of frequencies, right? A guitar has lows, mids, highs, and they're all important. There's not like a big gap in the middle. With bass and with kick drum, there typically is or can be, and you can really dial that in to your heart's content. You want more snap? Boost those high mids. You want more low end? Boost the lows or the low mids or some combination of those. They can work independently of one another. And that leads me to my final point. I've been in Nashville for a number of years. One of the things I learned from Nashville engineers when they would record bass guitar for even a country song, they would oftentimes, they would take that SansAmp plugin that comes with Pro Tools, and they would duplicate the bass track and slap this distortion plugin on the duplicate. Why would they do that? Because typically, clean bass doesn't work super well in the mix. You can hear the low end, but you can't hear any of the definition. It's hard to pick out the runs and the notes that the bass player is playing because all you're really getting from the bass is low end information. So by adding in this additive thing that adds more frequencies, that's what distortion and overdrive do. They're adding more harmonic frequencies up in the higher register. Now we have something that we can kind of adjust to hear the clarity on the bass more. The end result isn't a bass that sounds like it's from a heavy metal band. If you soloed it, you'd hear the buzz and the distortion, but in the mix, you just hear the bass. It sounds pretty clean, but you're picking up on those higher frequency pieces that allow you to hear it better, especially if you're listening on a phone or on small speakers or car stereos, things like that. So if your bass comes in and doesn't have a lot of upper mid-range information, you can create that by adding some distortion in some sort of parallel processing situation. What I like to do is to grab and create and capture that goodness on the front end when we record. So I'll have Joel kick on a pedal that adds some dirt or crank the drive on his Ampeg amp to give it some grit so that I don't have to do that later. I don't like clean bass. I like bass with a little bit of stank on it, and I think you should too. All right. All right, that wraps up this video. If you've made it this far and you like what you see here, you'll love my 5-step mix guide. And signing up for that guide gets you on my email list so I can let you know when new videos are live so you don't have to come over here to YouTube and go hunting for them. You can sign up for that all for free at 5stepmix.com. Thanks for watching. See ya.